Our story begins in the 19th century in a small and seemingly insignificant country known as Canada. Let's be real though, Canada is not small. Here, a middle aged man obsessed with trains and getting them to run on time published a set of papers detailing a methodology. Although the idea wasn't new, his presentation, doggedness, and ability to forge connections pushed forward a proposal that landed us what is today known as standardized time. To really get the story though, we need to go back. Well, maybe not that far. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan led an expedition from Spain to Indonesia in order to secure a trade route for spice. Famously, the voyage around the world lasted 3 years and came to be known as the Magellan Expedition. The trip was a marvel, but also proposed an interesting question. While circumnavigating the globe, they noticed the loss of a day despite meticulous record keeping. Puzzled, the sailors sought counsel. As the story goes, their questions were quickly answered by Cardinal Gasparo Contarini, who just happened to be stopping by and successfully figured out that they had lost a day by sailing to the west, the same direction as the sun. So, in the 16th century, they had this vague idea of time zones, but no real reason to do anything with the knowledge. Except, sailing, mapping, and really anything that involved a schedule. Needless to say, it was clear the idea of time and time zones was gonna pick up steam. Time was gaining traction. Hadn't it always been a thing? Well, yes and no. For people across most of human history, the only factor of time they considered was the rising and setting of the sun, and more generally, the months or seasons. Eventually, towns would have their own times that they set according to something like high noon, but that meant there was little consistency within a country. Even within a town, there was maybe one clock, or before clocks even, maybe one church bell with a guy judging the time off vibes. As you can tell, not super valued by the common man. Skipping ahead a few centuries, larger sea voyages were becoming more common. Sailors needed a way to measure time accurately, not just to know the hour, but to track distance and determine longitude during navigation. So to finish off our very brief history lesson before getting to the trains, we go to 18th century Britain. As the British Empire continued to grow and pillage, they decided that accurate navigation would probably be helpful in their efforts. To cut back on confusion stemming from time-related issues, they began publishing the Almanac, which used the longitude of Greenwich to give ships a standardized time and position. Because of the sheer size and scope of the British Empire, Greenwich Standard Time ended up being used by a lot of the world's ships, upwards of 70%. Still, until trains started to pop up, standard time outside of the sea wasn't really considered or needed. From their invention in 1804, it took 47 years for the British to be proud enough to show off their train collection in an exhibition. In an effort to look really invested in their little hobby, they wanted to ensure that the trains would run on schedule. Even before the exhibition, they were using the Greenwich Standard Time relayed by telegraph, but this settled it. And like all good change, the government refused to accept it until decades after. As other countries started to develop and to catch up to Britain technologically, they became very conscious of the timing problems that had plagued the British transport system. See, not a new problem. And with larger countries like the US, Canada, and Russia especially, timing and coordination were all the more important and challenging. So in 1871, 1-hour time zones were proposed in the United States, and around the same point, Russia was using a standardized time from St. Petersburg. Critically though, all of these countries had different standard times even in spite of most ships, regardless of their origin, using the one established by Greenwich. This is where a protagonist finally steps in. I know, it took a while. In 1879, Sandford Fleming was the chief engineer of the Intercolonial Railway and was in charge of planning for the proposed Canadian Pacific. Like any good engineer, he was good at finding problems, except he was also actually good at solving them. The idea of standardized time was not new, and even a global standard had been proposed prior, but between disputes of who gets the center of time and a lack of good follow-through, all previous efforts had fallen short. So what made Fleming so capable? Well, he was affable and good at making the right connections. Before making any connections though, there was a vision, a time system that actually made sense. Globally. So Fleming whipped up a set of proposals that ditched the confusing local sun-based clocks and instead carved the globe into 24 neat 1-hour zones. A universal clock for a world that's finally moving fast enough to need one. And what did Fleming do with this proposal? He took it to a British science conference, got denied entry, and decided the only way to save face was to settle for Canada and make it everyone else's problem. He rallied scientific institutions, railroad executives, and even American meteorologists like Cleveland Abbey who had been working on something similar. Together, they got the American Society of Civil Engineers, the Canadian Institute, and the American Meteorological Society on board. Surveys were sent out, railway companies were looped in, politicians were begged. The turning point came in 1883 when the railroads finally threw in the towel. With the help of W.F. Allen, a railroad secretary, the train people agreed to adopt Fleming's own system. On November 18th, clocks across North America jumped into sync. They called it the Day of Two Noons, which sounds dramatic, but most people just went about their days slightly more confused than usual. Still, for something involving multiple governments, corporations, and some 60 million odd people, it was shockingly smooth. But for Fleming, that wasn't enough. He wanted the world. So in 1884, he lobbied his way into the International Meridian Conference in Washington, where 25 countries gathered to answer one question: whose meridian gets to be the center of the universe? Fleming's proposal suggested Greenwich as the prime meridian, but France, naturally, wanted to do their own thing. Understanding where previous proposals had fallen short, Fleming came prepared. For one, the small detail that 70% of the world's ships already use Greenwich Standard Time. It also didn't hurt that the Meridian ran through the Royal Observatory, basically the NASA of the 19th century, and crucially, it didn't slice through any major population centers, which made it easier to implement without sparking territorial egos. So, while France grumbled and lobbied for a quote-unquote neutral meridian, the world just shrugged and went with what was already working. So Fleming did it. Sort of. Fleming's dream of a 24-hour global clock didn't immediately catch on. The Americans thought it sounded too European, and the whole unification of civil, nautical, and astronomical days got punted to the next century. But the foundation was there. The Canadians, to their credit, listened. The Americans didn't, and France eventually caved in 1911. By the time World War I hit, most countries had reluctantly standardized time, if only because it made bombing each other more efficient. And that's it. So, if the extremely interesting topic of time zones ever comes up in conversation, just remember this: you can blame a Canadian. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and sharing. I'm getting really close to 500 subs, and every little bit truly helps. Thanks again, and here's another video that you might enjoy.